So good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our keynote, the ending keynote for the day today, where we have Professor Vinod Venkatraman from Temple University. He is currently a faculty member and the director of a Center for Applied Research and Decision Making at the Fox School of Business, Temple University, where he has been teaching since July 2011 after his PhD from Duke. He's one of the leading researchers, scholars, and consultant in the area of neuroscience, the application of neurophysiological and neuroimaging methodologies to study the effects of context state and individual traits on decision preferences. He is one of the leading experts in this area of the applications of neuroscience and marketing. And we are very proud and privileged to have him here today, a researcher who has published in journals, top journals like Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of Neuroscience, Neuron, Journal of Consumer Psychology. There are very few people who are able to span both sides of the aisle, so to speak, in core neuroscience journals as well as marketing journals. And he also has featured in popular media outlets such as BBC and LA Times and Newsweek. Delighted to have you here, Vinod. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and look forward to your half-an-hour presentation, after which we will be having a conversation on the presentation and other things. Over to you. So.
Thank you, Arvind. Thank you for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. Like I was just telling Arvind, I wish I could be there in person, but we have to make do with the current circumstances. So I'm glad at least I can meet some of you virtually and share some of my recent work. So the work I'm presenting today, actually, I'm excited to say that only this week it was conditionally accepted in Journal of Marketing Research. So very happy about that, and I think the talk is very timely from that point of view also. So the work that I'm presenting today, like I said, is about print versus digital advertising. But like Arvind alluded to, I have been working in the area of consumer neuroscience for the last 8 to 10 years now, since I started at Temple. And the reason I started doing it is because when I was doing my PhD, I noticed that there were a lot of studies that essentially were focused on mapping what happens in the brain. So these involve things like dissociating psychological processes, identifying neural signatures, neural correlates, neural predictors, whatever you may see. You might have seen most of these terms if you read the literature in Fmri, where people are trying to take some interesting phenomenon and try and map what happens in the brain, or what are some correlates of that phenomenon in the brain. And so this was essentially most of the collaboration that existed in the field. It was people in psychology and neuroscience departments occasionally reaching across the aisle to people in the business school or the marketing side and looking for some interesting questions and then trying to identify what happens in the brain. So this involved things like identifying shopping preferences, risk preferences, and so on. Everything essentially was focused on the arrow going in this direction. But more recently, and this was part of why I made the move to the business school after my PhD, was then to ask the question, if we know something about what happens in the brain, what does it mean from a marketing perspective? Like, how can we use that insight subsequently to change something about how we market items, to change something about how we present information, and so on, right? So this is basically the other part of the arrow, which is like starting from things like measuring implicit processes, which is essentially that if people cannot articulate how they feel or why they're doing something, can we get some additional insights into that? How can we adjudicate between different marketing theories for the same phenomenon? And then more recently, of course, there is a big push in this idea towards neuroforecasting, which is essentially the idea that you take the data from a small group of participants in a lab using tools like Fmri, and then try and predict what's going to happen at the population level, right? And lastly, of course, you can also think of using some of these methods as a segmentation tool, so that again, you can get additional insights beyond just the traditional demographics or age-based segmentation and so on. Right? So that's the idea. That's a little bit of a background on my transition from doing a PhD in psychology and neuroscience into marketing, and a lot of the focus on my work is essentially on the things at the bottom of the screen. And so today, what I want to talk to you about is basically two studies, and if time permits, very briefly on a third study. But both these studies are essentially focused on this idea of looking at the effectiveness of print versus digital advertising. So those things that you actually hold in your hand, those postcards kind of advertisements that you get, versus things that come in your email where you just get an ad and you click on it, or you just see it and you delete it, or whatever you do. But basically, if that same message is sent in either of these formats, is there a difference in terms of how people process it, and in terms of its effectiveness subsequently from a purchasing perspective or memory perspective, and so on, right? So both these studies are related. The first one is a more consumer neuroscience study, which uses a variety of different methodologies. And the second one focuses more on a follow-up way of how do we then take some insights from neuroscience to design better behavioral studies and get additional insights that you may not have thought of before. So that's essentially how these two studies are set up, right? So like I said, the broad idea here is this point about multi-channel advertising. And the question is, are all marketing channels equally effective in reaching out to consumers, right? So today, especially, there's an explosion of different channels and different outlets. And so the key question that we are trying to ask here is, if you send the same message across these different channels, is it being received in the same manner, or is one channel more effective relative to the other, right? So specifically, we are focusing on print versus digital defined very broadly, which means it is presented on a device. It's as simple as that, as opposed to something that's physically printed in front of you that you're holding in your hand. And more importantly, we wanted to focus on how these channels impact the different stages of a buying process. So if you take a simple example, if you want to purchase something, usually there is a need recognition. You recognize the need that you want this product or an item. Then usually you do some search, you're exposed to some information, either currently or you've been exposed to some information related to it in the past that you dig through and you try to identify again. And then you consolidate all the information that you have. And then usually when you're about to make the purchase at the point of sale, you retrieve some of this information and it translates into action, right? So even in other cases, you may think of it as, even if you don't have a need, you may get an advertisement for something, you may put it aside, but maybe a month later or a week later or whatever, you may be in the store and it may suddenly trigger your memory. I remember seeing an ad for this, or I remember seeing a discount for this. What do I want to do with that information? Do I want to buy that brand or buy that product, and so on, right? So it goes into these two distinct phases. One is the exposure phase, another one is the retrieval phase. And that's what we will try and focus on here, with the additional question that what additional insights can neuroscience provide over and beyond just the behavioral information that we have. And I must say that this entire series of work was actually sponsored by the United States Postal Service. So they supported us through a grant, and clearly they were interested in this topic because the print media was getting lesser and lesser popular, and that was one of their primary sources of revenue. And so they wanted to see whether there is still value in continuing to provide this service, and how does print media position itself in today's digital world. So that's a little bit of a background on how these studies were funded. So when we talk about these kinds of things from a consumer neuroscience perspective, usually we focus on four constructs that are extremely important for understanding consumer behavior. One is, of course, attention. That is basically happens during the exposure phase in this case. What are people paying attention to, and what are people processing when information is presented? Then there's arousal/emotion. So this is essentially these two work hand in hand in many ways. So in some ways, emotions drive attention. And so you need something captivating. When you present an ad, you want that first aha moment such that it breaks through, and then people get interested, and then people process more information that's presented to the ad. So arousal is obviously, again, another important factor, and it's more critical during the exposure too. And then two other things that are more important in the second half are, one, of course, is memory, because many times you make a purchase at a later point of time, and so you need to be able to retrieve the contents of an ad that you were exposed to, and of course, action, desirability or action. So this is where you translate it into making a purchase or buying the product and so on. All right. So this is not something new. Many people have proposed various frameworks for studying memory in advertising. Of course, just like what I was talking to you here, often it's proposed as there are three phases to it. First is encoding, or when you initially are exposed to the information and you store it appropriately in memory. Then there's the retention phase. So this is when you are trying to hold on to that information. And lastly, of course, there's the retrieval phase. When it becomes relevant, are you able to retrieve the information in an effective manner? The encoding is influenced by two factors, like what is the content, what format it's presented, and so on. And of course, the characteristics of the viewer. Were you interested in the product? Were you paying attention to the ad when it was being presented? Or did you completely switch off and not do so, right? And one of the ways in which this has been proposed in the past is this idea of associative networks. So every time you're exposed to some information, it gets tagged on into a specific network. And then if you keep repeatedly being exposed to that, then those connections get stronger and stronger, that you form a very strong brand associative map, especially with brands that are relevant for you, and you retrieve it accordingly. So that's again the traditional ways in which these things have been thought about, right? And so it's important to know how these things are measured. In fact, most of the literature that you will find out there basically focuses on retrieval differences. It's very hard to study encoding because you just don't know what's going on when people are looking at information. So the best way to get at encoding is to use retrieval as a proxy. You either do it after a delay or after a day, and you ask people some information about what they were exposed to. And if they retrieve it correctly, then you say, oh, they encoded it well, right? So that's the way most of the memory literature works. Retrieval is used as a proxy for the strength of encoding. And of course, there are several things that can happen. You might not have encoded it in the first place because you just didn't pay attention. You might have been exposed to a lot of other competing information after you were exposed to the original one, which means there was retroactive interference. And so you don't remember the original trace, or the trace is too weak. And lastly, of course, you need strong retrieval cues. If you want to try and retrieve some information, you need some kind of an aid or facilitation effect to be able to go back to say like, oh, I remember something about this happened a week ago, or this ad was in this magazine that I was reading. And so it may be relevant for what I'm trying to purchase over here, right? So that's the link between encoding and memory. But oftentimes in the traditional literature, encoding is ignored in some ways because the only way to get at encoding is by looking at what's happening at retrieval. And when we look at retrieval, again, there are two ways in which you do it. One is just recall or free recall, which is basically you just said, like, you saw a bunch of ads in the magazine you were reading. Can you recall all the brands that were featured in it, right? Then the onus is on you to generate the retrieval cues. You may think that, oh, on this page, I was reading an article about this, and I remember seeing an ad at the bottom of that page, right? So that's how the free recall works. You generate your own retrieval cues, and you use those cues to go and identify the question that's being posed in front of you. So in this case, any errors could be either due to the inability to generate effective retrieval cues, or you just didn't encode it in the first place. Either of them can cause for memory errors. It can be related purely to the encoding phase, or it could be related to the retrieval phase because you're just not able to generate good, effective retrieval cues. The other one is recognition. So here, you're not asked explicitly name all of these, but you're just asked, can you say whether you've seen this before? So there is a cue, and you're asked to say, did you see this face in an ad before? Or did you see an ad for XYZ brand before? And usually it's mixed with some foils, which means there are some brands that you didn't see and some brands that you saw. And you just try to recognize to say like which ones you saw and which ones you didn't see. And because the cues are presented to you in this case, any differences are primarily due to the failure to encode. It's not due to the difficulty in generating the retrieval cues, right? So often recognition performance tends to be higher than recall because the cues help. But the question is, even with the cues, especially as the delays increase, can you retrieve the information appropriately? Or did the memory trace decay significantly that you don't have access to that information anymore, right? And these things are important because again, you can't get at some of these nuances just by looking at memory data, just by asking people either immediately or a week later, what do you remember about things that you saw, right? So it means very different things when you see recall differences without recognition or vice versa. So that's important as it leads to what we know from the prior literature. I know there's a lot going on here. I won't go through this whole slide, but there have been some studies that have tried to look at print versus digital. And so that's what's on the left column over here. But the key thing here is almost all of these studies did not have much of a retrieval delay. So you're exposed to information, and right after you're asked some questions about the information that you were exposed to. So the decay component is not enough time for interference or decay in all of these studies. And some use recall and some use recognition. And as you can see here, there is crisscrossing of results. Some find differences in recall without differences in recognition, and others find differences in recognition without differences in recall, right? And based on that, the claims that they make are also very different. So it's not that others haven't studied it, but the few papers that I've looked at it, even though some of the results seem to point that print leads to better memory, but they are a little bit all over the place in terms of the projected mechanisms, like what is causing it or what are some explanations for this. And that's what motivated us to go and look further into this using a very novel kind of design where we can use some of these neuroscience methodologies. So that brings me to the proposed studies. So the first one, the way we did it is we split people into two phases. So everybody comes into the lab. In the first phase, they are exposed to information. And when they are exposed to this information, we are collecting some of this biometric data. So we are getting things like eye tracking, skin conductance, and heart rate, in addition to them being exposed to the information. And then a week later, unbeknownst to them, they come back for an fMRI session. But what happens in this fMRI session is it's basically a surprise memory test. So most participants believe they are coming back because we're just going to repeat the study in fMRI. But actually, in effect, what happens is we basically tell them, now you're going to be shown some materials mixed with new materials, and you have to tell us whether you saw this as a part of your first session or not. So it's a memory test from that point of view. And what we are most interested in is, are there differences as people are retrieving this information from memory, right? And the reason why we focused on fMRI during phase 2 is because, as you may know, if you have done an fMRI study before, it is very difficult to interact with physical materials in the scanner. The environment is not conducive to movement. And so you cannot have somebody scrolling through physical information when they're lying down in the scanner. And so we did the exposure outside the scanner, but during retrieval, everything is digital. All they see is a copy of the ad, and they have to say whether they have seen this ad before or not, and if they've seen which format they saw it. And so it's a lot easier that way. And we know a lot from the prior cognitive neuroscience literature on how retrieval memory works. And so we can use that to go back and make some claims again about encoding and what these differences are related to. So in terms of the design, this is what happens. People come into the lab first week. We are using a moment-to-moment experience capture using eye tracking and biometrics. People are presented 40 different marketing stimuli, and 20 of these are shown in print format and 20 of these are shown in digital format. And the order is counterbalanced. So every ad, half the people are seeing that ad in a print format, and other half of the people are seeing that ad in the digital format. So we get full control that way. It's not like the popular ads are in print and the less popular ads are digital. Everything is controlled for from that point of view. And more importantly, we try to make sure that we kept everything as close as possible. So we use the same size. So whatever they're seeing on the screen, the size of the postcard is the same size that's printed. We tried our best to control for brightness and so on when we were exposing participants to some of these things. So these are some examples of the types of ads that people saw. And essentially, like I said, there are about 40 of these. They are not from a specific genre. They are mixed across different categories and so on. So this is a quick example of an experience that somebody is currently going through. Let me see if I can find my cursor here. Yeah, so this is an electronic version of this. So basically the way this was set up is it's like you get a set of, we set it up as a simulated inbox with a set of emails that have come from different people. A participant has to go click on a particular email and an ad opens up. And then they have to basically process the ad. They were not given any specific instructions. They were basically told to interact with the ad and process each one. And they could take however long they wanted. There were no time constraints. And in fact, that was one of the variables we were interested in. How long do people interact with these ads in either of these formats, right? Once they're done with an ad, they go and click on another one, and then another ad opens up, and then they do the same thing, right? And the things that you see here are basically on the left are basically data, live data that's coming from both their heart rate monitoring as well as the skin conductance as they are processing these ads. Okay. And then the second one that we did is basically a print format. So this is that same ad of a representative of a different subject, of course, because the same subject does not see the ad in more than one format. But a different participant who was looking at the same ad in print format looks something like this. So they're basically given a stack of postcards that they're holding on to. They take one card at a time and they put it on a viewing platform. So this way we control for some of these haptics and stuff like that when they are actually processing the information. So we record the information from the time they put it on the platform to the time that they remove it from the platform. That's the window that we are most interested in. But at the same time, there is a little bit of this moving in and out, the haptic touch and so on when people are looking at this information. And of course, we are interested in where people are focusing on and how much time people are spending. Again, the time is defined as time in to time out. How long does it take for people to process this? So what are some key findings? We asked people some basic attitude questions about what do they feel about the ad. So we asked them like, how familiar are you with this ad? How much do you like it? How relevant these? And these are all questions that they answer right at exposure after seeing the ad. And in most of these, even though it leans a little bit towards digital being like treated as being more familiar, more liked, and so on, none of these differences reach significance. So there were no significant effects in terms of general brand attitudes about the ads just immediately following exposure. And this is not surprising because people may be familiar with some of these brands, and a single exposure in either print or digital format is not going to change their attitudes completely, right? But more importantly, what we were interested in is processing differences during encoding, right? So this is the first actual contribution from this study, because so far, like I said, all inferences about encoding were based on what happens at retrieval. But now, because we have all these different methodologies, we can look at what is actually happening during encoding. And there were a few interesting findings. The first is that people process print ads longer than digital ads in general, right? So when they're looking at print materials, even leaving out the fact that they're moving it to moving out, from the time they put it on the board till the time they remove it from the board, they spend much longer with print ads than they're doing with digital ads. And this is also true in terms of the number of fixations. People do have larger number of fixations when they're processing printed materials than when they're processing digital materials. But this was not biased towards, it's not that they were looking at maybe the brand and ignoring everything else. So if we looked at the proportion of time spent on the product or proportion of the time spent on the brand name, they were basically pretty similar. So out of the total response time, people were allocating similar amount of time to brands and products and so on. So overall, they were processing lesser, but it was not because they just looked at one part of it and ignored everything else. So that's important. Or at least the key parts like brand and product receive equal proportion of the total duration being allocated to them. But in terms of other strategies, what was also interesting is the pupil dilation was higher when you're looking at print ads than when you're looking at digital ads. And this is controlling for baseline changes too, because there may be some baseline differences with print versus digital because we were using different ways of tracking them. So even when you control for the baseline changes and looked at what's happening with respect to the baseline changes, print ads were generally associated with larger pupil dilation. This is again indicative of probably more arousal and more effort when people were processing print materials than digital materials. People also did more distance travel. So if you look at what's the breadth of information people process when they're looking at print versus digital, people processed a lot more information. Like they went to more parts of the ad with print than they were doing it with digital. But if you look at the dwell time for each fixation, they were longer in digital than print. So in digital, people were making like shorter number of fixations, but each fixation was longer. So they go to a place once, they process it a little bit deeply, then go to the next one, right? So from that point of view, it was like they almost had a more systematic way. They knew exactly what they wanted to look at, and they spent slightly longer with each fixation, and then they moved on, and they made lesser number of fixations overall. So that's something that's important and interesting too. And these data were also consistent with the biometric data, which showed that the skin conductance level again was larger for print, consistent more arousal for print materials, whereas the high frequency heart rate variability was higher for digital, which is kind of consistent with this more systematic or more attention being paid to certain aspects of the ad. So that's with the larger dwell time and this high frequency heart rate variability go hand in hand, which suggests that people were processing lesser, but whatever they were processing it a little bit more deeply than they were doing in print materials, right? So what does all this mean for long-term memory then? So there were some interesting differences in terms of what people were doing in encoding. So what happens at retrieval, right? So like I said, people come back for an fMRI session and they're asked 3 questions. Do you remember seeing the ad? What format did you see it in? And how confident are you in your response? Okay, and people were shown the whole ads again, and they were also mixed with some new ads that they had not seen before. So there were some foils, and they had to correctly distinguish the ads from the foils. Now, one of the problems was, even though it was a week apart, we had huge ceiling effects in this. So about 90, in fact, like I think the accuracy was 99 and 98% in people correctly recognizing the ads that they had seen before, because we were showing the whole ads, and this was basically the ads were familiar in some ways. People did correctly distinguish them from the things that they had not seen before. And so we didn't find any behavioral differences in the study due to ceiling effects. But when we asked for source, like when we asked people, what format did you see it in? People were more accurate in identifying the print format than they were in the digital format. So they were also quicker, they were more confident, and they could say like, yeah, I saw it in print, but digital was a little bit more mixed from that point of view. And then, of course, we have the fMRI data. I'm just going to skip some of this in the interest of time. But if you look at neural differences, so we first localized regions in the brain that track memory. So regions in the brain that are showing greater activation for things that you have seen before versus not seen before. And specifically, what we found is nice bilateral hippocampal activation and also bilateral parahippocampus over here, right? So these are regions within the medial temporal lobe that are strongly being shown to be associated with memory differences in the cognitive neuroscience literature. And so that's not surprising that we see these being activated for memory effects. But more importantly, what we asked was, can these regions be a precursor? Can they show differences as a function of print versus digital? And so that's what this is. In both of these regions, in the left hippocampus and left parahippocampal place area, what we see is that if you look at the print minus digital, that difference is significantly greater than 0. In other words, these regions show greater activation for print relative to digital materials, right? So even though we don't see behavioral differences, the brain data seem to indicate that if you made the task harder, or maybe if you increase the delay for longer, there is enough in terms of brain differences that maybe you would start teasing out some of these behavioral differences in terms of print versus digital, right? So that's basically the key here. And so that led us to study 2, where we learned something from study 1. And the main finding was that even though there were some signs that print may lead to better memory, and there were some differences at encoding, maybe the task was too simple. And so if we made the task harder, you would start seeing some of these behavioral differences. That was essentially the hypothesis for study 2. So the idea was exactly the same, except that there was no neurophysiology here. So no eye tracking, no biometrics, and no fMRI. It was a purely behavioral study. But the primary difference here was that rather than show people the whole ad, we only showed them snippets in phase 2, right? So this is what phase 2 looked like. So they don't see the whole ad, but they see maybe a face, maybe a caption, or maybe a scene from the ad. And they're asked to say, do you remember seeing this as a part of an ad before? If yes, which ad was it from? So now you get a direct link to brand recognition, which is an important part of this, right? So not only do you remember seeing it, but you can correctly attribute it to what brand is associated with that particular picture, right? So that's the second big difference in this one. And so we also did a categorization as face, scenes, and word because we thought maybe there'd be some interesting differences there. And again, we didn't find any broad behavioral differences. They were all, again, leaning slightly towards digital when you ask people about their attitudes, but none of these were significantly different. But here's the key one here, right? So again, now you see a significant difference in recognition memory with people actually correctly categorizing the snippets from print ads better than digital ads. But more importantly, you see a significant difference also in the brand recognition, which means not only are people recognizing the snippets, they are more accurately attributing it to the brand that was featured in the ad relative to digital. So you get this more holistic encoding where you remember the things better, and you can also form better association, which means you can link the face to the brand much better when it was presented in print format than when it was printed in digital format. And this one's the last data slide. So again, here, you don't see any difference. I mean, you see a significant effect of format when you're trying to predict these on a trial by trial level as a function of which format was it or what type the snippet was. The snippet type did not have an effect in all of these models. And then the last thing that we wanted to do was, if you control for the engagement, like the time that they're spending on the ad in phase one, does it fully explain some of these differences? And what's interesting is while engagement does predict some of these effects, it still does not take away the format effect. So there is something beyond just the time spent on the ad that's leading to some of these differences across format. And that's true for brand recognition as well as source recognition. In all of these cases, you get similar kinds of results, right? So overall, print ads were associated with higher arousal and longer processing. They're generally processed longer than digital ads. Digital ads were shorter, but more systematic. And print ads were associated with better long-term memory, both in terms of brand associations as well as context encoding. And lastly, of course, I didn't talk about this because we didn't find anything. We did try to measure also differences in self-reported willingness to pay and purchase intentions in phase two, but the results were not consistent. It's not that there wasn't anything, but across the two studies, we didn't find consistent results. And so that's something that we need to consider in future studies. And I'm going to leave it with a set of questions to ponder. We can come back to this in the panel maybe later if it's of interest. But basically, the big question here is the internal versus external validity. Like, did the way we do the study take away from the natural way in which people interact with some of this stuff? And so what is the validity or what is the extendability of some of these findings? We also presented ads in isolation. In reality, that never happens. Ads are always in context of an ad or a show or something else. So what does that mean for the results? Because we are not being distracted, you're being forced to look at the ads as opposed to something that happens in the real world. And so it removes the natural aspect of interacting with some of these ads, right? So those are all some things. Like I said, we can come back to this, or I'm happy to take more questions and talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, very counter to the normal flow of things today where everything is going digital, where a very rigorous experiment and study is showing that print advertisements actually lead to a higher level of memory, including source recognition and brand recognition, which is very interesting indeed. So thank you for that very much, Vinod. We are joined also by now by Harish Bhat. Mr. Harish Bhat is, let me very quickly introduce Mr. Harish Bhat to the audience. Some of you may have been there in the morning, but he's the brand custodian at Tata Sons. He joined the Tata Group as an officer in TAS, Tata Administrative Services, and he's on the board of several Tata companies. And during his career of 34 years with the Tata Group, he's held many senior roles, including Managing Director of Tata Global Beverages and Chief Operating Officer with the Titan Company. And he has nurtured many iconic brands like Fast Track, Tanishq, Tata Tea, and has played an important role in the turnaround of the jewelry business. He's an alumnus of BITS Pilani and of IIM Ahmedabad. Harish is a very prolific writer, as well as he is on the Economic Development Board of the Government of Singapore. He's written quite a few books. I've read 2 of them, not all of them. Harish, let me introduce you to Vinod Venkatraman. Vinod is a faculty member at Temple University. His PhD is in psychology and neuroscience from Duke, after which he kind of crossed the river and came over to the marketing side, the dark side. And now he tries to span over on both sides. He is one of the few people who publishes regularly in the top journals, both in marketing as well as in neuroscience, Journal of Neuroscience, Neuron, as well as what he presented just now, and the results that I was just citing are conditionally accepted in the Journal of Marketing Research. So thank you both, gentlemen, for being over here. What I would like to do as your facilitator for this panel is to kind of set the context a little bit. We, as both of you know, this is our first attempt to put together a conference on behavioral science and management in India, with a heavy dose of application orientation, drawing from psychology and neuroscience, the base disciplines that Vinod did his PhD in. And what I would like to be able to do is to take advantage of the presence of 2 experts in different ways. One with a very deep knowledge and understanding of psychology and neuroscience, and a training to apply it to the marketing discipline from a research standpoint, and another who has been doing the application for a very long period of time and has nurtured several brands over a long period of time, and brought them to iconic status in the Indian context, and is also currently very deeply engaged in working to create research that is applicable for businesses. We at IIM Ahmedabad have collaborated with Harish's group to do research, and we are actually working on something as we speak. So gentlemen, what I would like to do is to set the ball rolling by asking you the following question. And this will draw and build on the research that you've just presented, Vinod. The research that you presented essentially suggests that because of a higher level of engagement, perhaps, memory is stronger for print advertisements as compared to digital advertisements. And from a brand perspective, clearly, one of the things that a brand marketer would like to be able to do is to very deeply embed their brand in the memory of the customer. The more deeply the brand is embedded in the memory of the customer, the stronger arguably is the strength of the brand, because ultimately that is what, and of course I'm assuming that it's a positive memory, that is the raison d'etre for a good brand, leading to good brand performance. Now, if I divide that memory now, there are 2 kinds of memory which are present, right? Declarative and non-declarative memories. The declarative memory is much more conscious, semantic, or episodic. The non-declarative memory is more on the side of timed memory or procedural memory or associative memories. So I'm just kind of curious to know, and we'll start with your observations on this, Vinod, and then I'm going to ask Harish as well to comment on this. How do you see that as happening typically from a brand and advertising perspective? How much does it get into the conscious memory? How much in the unconscious memory? Do we even know, or is there a way of finding it out? So over to you, Vinod.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I skipped over it. I did have, let me just pull up my, in the interest of time, I went fast on it, but I think this is what you're referring to, Arvind, in terms of the different types of long-term memory that you have. So the ones that we are focusing on in the context of how we set up the study is what we call episodic memory, which means at a particular time, you're being exposed to an event and subsequently you're asked, like, as a part of this study, you were shown some ads. Do you remember some of these ads, right? So it is triggered to a specific episode, in this case being a participant in this study, and to the ads that you are exposed to as a function of that particular episode. So that's basically comes under this idea of declarative memory. It is something that's happening currently that is very context dependent and so on. And then you have the other kind, which is the non-declarative memory, which is what is also called the procedural memory. And so these are things that are kind of embedded, that happen in some ways without as much conscious attention to it. Like the example that memory research is often used is learning to ride a bike. When you're first learning, you're very conscious about
Oops,
holding
we
the
seem to have
handlebar,
lost
trying
him.
to find the balance. Sorry, you okay?
Sorry, your voice broke for about 3 or 4 seconds, Vinod. So if you
Okay.
could just go back to the point, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just saying the classic example that memory researchers use for this is learning to ride a bike. Like when you're first learning to ride a bike, you're very aware of holding the handlebar tight and pedaling, and you're focusing on all of these things. But once you get a hang of it, none of this is things that you're processing. It's basically a skill that you have developed. It happens automatically, and it moves on, right? And so that's the idea, and that has a lot of parallel to the question that Arvind was asking in terms of brands and memory too. Of course, if you're a new brand, you are starting off from this episodic phase. Like if the first time you're being exposed to an ad or something like that, everybody maybe talks about that ad. Did you see that new ad during Super Bowl or a cricket game that was being telecast, and the new brand that's being launched? But over time, if the brand is popular, it shifts from this declarative to the non-declarative. It becomes a part of your vocabulary. The associative network for that brand is very strong, that when you think of that product, that's one of the first things that comes into play. So when you think of a phone, pretty much automatically triggers the associative network for an iPhone or an Apple, and maybe Samsung or something like that. But that's essentially a phase where you're no longer have to think about like, is Apple making a phone anymore? You think of a phone, you automatically know that iPhone comes into that that memory trigger over there. And so that's basically the kind of network. The question that we are asking is, how do you get from these initial exposures to that network? One aspect that we are focusing on here is the format in which the information is presented, but that's not the only one. Like there are so many other things that contribute, and in fact, others may have a larger amount of variance in terms of the contribution. It's not that people did not remember anything about digital. They remembered maybe at the 75 to 80% compared to 85% for print, right? So that's only the amount of variance that we are explaining in this study. But there are obviously a lot of other factors, like how effective was the ad, like what were some other things that people use to capture your attention when the ad is being shown, and how do you follow through? That's extremely important too. So if you're a new brand, or if you're not a popular brand right now and you want to break into this associative network, then the best way to do it is to consolidate that memory. You keep showing ads, or you keep trying different versions of it until it becomes embedded in people's memory. And at that point, people remember exactly what the campaign is or what the ad is, and it becomes more of the unconscious or automatic processing level.
Thanks, Vinod. I was wondering what Harish's thoughts on this transition would be from his experience.
Yeah, it is very, very interesting what Vinod has just said and what you've said about declarative and non-declarative memory. And I do agree with what Vinod has said, that the movement from the declarative to the non-declarative happens over time. Brands typically start on the left-hand side of this wonderful chart that he has put up here. But I think there are three factors at play there. More than the format itself, I agree with Vinod, there's more at play. One is how much the brand has become part of your life. And when I say become part of your life, it doesn't mean, Arvind, that people should be using the brand. It's part of your life if it is ubiquitous, if it's all around you, it's got embedded in your day-to-day life. So it kind of seeps into your subconscious. And two examples that I can give you here. You know, you ask people in India to name a brand that they associate with salt. I would say a lot of people are going to come up with the name Tata. You ask people to associate a name that they think of with milk, a lot of people are going to say Amul. Now, both these brands have been around for long. They've also been ubiquitous and part of your day-to-day life. You see them everywhere around you, notwithstanding whether you use them or not. So I think that's one factor for a brand to seep into your subconscious. The second, Arvind, from a practitioner's point of view is, it really depends, if a brand becomes a market leader and dominant in a category, it's like the Apple and telephone example that Vinod spoke about. If a brand becomes very, very dominant in a category and occupies idea leadership in that category and market leadership as well. In the case of Apple in the US, I would contend it's both idea leadership and market leadership. Then I think the brand seeps into the non-declarative or the subconscious memory. So that's a second way in which it can happen. The third is there are some brands which resonate with. There are some brands which resonate with your philosophy of life, which resonate with the kind of person you are. So you ask a young modern Indian woman, for brands that resonate with her, she may say Tanishq resonates with me in the jewelry category. So if a brand resonates with you, then it doesn't need to be very old. It can still seep into your subconscious because it kind of, it's like resonance in physics. The two metals or whatever start chiming together. So I would say resonance is one, ubiquity is one, and dominance or market leadership is the other for brands to really move into the non-declarative side, Arvind. That's my view as a practitioner.
Wonderful. I think that's kind of sets up the next question very automatically for both of you. Now, clearly, Tata is a very, very well-established brand, right? 150-plus-year-old brand. However, most brands, if they are coming to the market, and even within the Tata stable, for example, there will be some brands which will be new and that may not have as much of the backing of the Tata name. So when one is starting out with a new brand and that wants to get into the unconscious memory, because if I can make this contention, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Vinod, if a brand is more embedded in the unconscious memory, arguably it's a bit stronger. So now if I agree with Harish's contention that there are these three dimensions, ubiquity, leadership, idea, and presence leadership, and resonance. Clearly, ubiquity is not going to be there for the new brand, and neither is the leadership in the beginning. So it boils down to resonance to be able to get into the unconscious, non-declarative memory much more quickly. So therefore, both from the perspective of the practitioner over here and the perspective of an academic, I would like to invite your thoughts on what might be some action points that enable an acceleration of the movement into the non-declarative memory for a brand. And let me start because Harish has kind of left us at that point. I will ask Harish first, and then I will come to you, Vinod.
So, I think the acceleration is possible through 3 or 4 factors, Arvind. One is, like I said, how sharp is the idea of the brand and how sharp is your idea of the target consumer? Is the idea of your brand resonating with that right target consumer? If you've got that right, I believe that it can accelerate much faster. Let me give you an example. And I'm quoting examples from my own career because those are the brands I know best. Take a brand like Fast Track, which is a youth brand in India. Now, the brand was established to resonate with people in the 17 to 22-year bracket, college goers, late teens, early jobber, maybe a few early jobbers. And the brand was then able to build resonance with that target audience very sharply through Move On, through the kinds of products it had, through the kind of advertising it did, and so forth. So my belief is that Fast Track seeping into the subconscious of that target segment happened much faster because of the resonance. So that's the resonance is clearly one way of acceleration. The other clearly is, how eventually, I think the amount of investment you put into a brand, and whether it is in press media, whether it is in television or in digital, eventually a new brand has to create awareness. Resonance can only come once awareness is created. So the ability to create that awareness through media investment or through any other method that the brand prefers to use. It could be through PR, it could be through good publicity, it could be through influencers, whatever means the brand chooses to use. So I think cutting beyond the threshold level of awareness is important. And in India, I have found that if you really need to move into the right-hand side, you need to quickly build spontaneous awareness to at least a 35-40% level. Then a brand starts seeping into the right hand side. If a brand remains in single digits or early double digits on spontaneous awareness, then you're still a very I'm talking of spontaneous awareness in the target segment that you want to accelerate this move in. So that's second. And the third would probably be, Arvind, in my view, uh, your ability to kind of differentiate yourself, or let me say, break the clutter, because we only have so much space in our mind for brands to seep into this non-declarative memory. And I wish, at some stage, if you're able to size the non-declarative memory. I don't know. I don't know too much about this subject, but therefore, how unique is your brand? Like Apple has become a very unique brand, and therefore very quickly moved into this non-declarative memory. How unique is your brand, and how much of the clutter is it able to break through in the memory of people? Those are three hypotheses, Arvind, that I'd like to put forward. But I really don't have. I only have my experience. I don't have research backing that up.
Thanks, Harish. Over to you, Vinod.
Yeah, and I can speak from the other side. I don't have experience, but I can talk about how memory researchers think about this at least. I think the key here is every time you're exposed to some information, it generates a memory trace. And that memory trace can be very strong or very weak. And that memory trace can get refreshed every other time that you're getting exposed to information. So there are cases when the first exposure creates a big aha moment, like you didn't expect it. There is the way the ad was positioned, it either used like all the big people or a lot of celebrities or whatever it is to launch the brand. And so you remember it, it's embedded immediately in you. You have such a strong face. There are other cases where it may be a small one, but you see so many different variants of it that over time, this trace gets refreshed again and again and again, and it becomes part of your associative network. At the end of the day, the goal is we all have these networks in brain where all these relationships between various things are stored. And so when you're first exposed to a word, like when you think of a phone, which trace gets retrieved immediately is the one that is currently strongest within your associative network, right? And the way you become strong is either if it's an established brand through all the things we talked about before, but if you're a new brand, Harish already pointed out a few different ways. And so that's each of those. And I think the resonance or the first exposure is usually important. In US, companies spend like several millions for advertising on Super Bowl day for that reason. Like many times new consumers, their goal is not to promote the product. They won't even talk about what the features of the product or whatever it is. It's just to get the brand out there. Because then if you remember the brand, I can then build on it subsequently. I can do the distinguishing factors and stuff like that in follow-up ads in subsequent weeks. But then the big idea there is everybody is tuned in, everybody is watching. Let me get the key idea across about the brand, kind of a thing, right? So that's one way in which you break through. And then the other one, and we're doing some work on this with respect to advertising itself. In this one, we didn't control the types of advertisements. But we have done a follow-up study where we look at functional, emotional, and metaphorical advertisements. So functional is just an ad that just talks about the product, the features, and so on. Emotion obviously brings more emotion to it, which is usually very common in most advertisements today, especially if you're talking about TV advertisements. It's either having a little baby or having some pets and so on, and essentially building a story around it rather than just talk about the product directly, right? But the third category, which is kind of getting popular, especially with single shot advertisements like still advertisements, is this idea of metaphors, where you don't directly convey the meaning of the product, but you convey it through some metaphor. And so what happens in that case is it needs the consumer, it intrigues the consumer to think a little bit more about what's the relationship here. Why are you showing this as part of this ad? And what do we have to do as a result of it, right? And what that does is automatically increases curiosity, automatically increases the attention people are paying to it. And once it increases that attention, then essentially it also improves the memory of you remembering the brand. And so that's one One other approach that could be used, especially if you're a new brand, to create some kind of a conflict, to create some kind of a thing that makes you think a little bit deeper when you're first being exposed to the product or the ad or whatever it may be, because that leads to subsequently better memory. And we see this in our studies where metaphorical ads have the strongest memory, followed by emotional, and functional has the lowest in most of our ad categories. And more importantly, though, emotion, you tend to remember some of the features, but sometimes emotion fails because people don't make the linkage. Like if your emotion is so strong on the kid or the celebrity or whatever it is that people cannot relate it to the brand, then it's not a successful campaign, right? So somehow you have to make the link that they remember the celebrity who was featured in the ad and also remember what the ad was for. And we see that sometimes that breaks down with emotional ads, which is why over time it doesn't do as well. But metaphorical ads tend to do much better than the other two categories in some of our own work.
Oh, that's extremely, I think, interesting and informative from both of you, Vinod and Harish. So kind of building on the point that you just made, Vinod, on metaphorical and emotional and functional. Metaphors are often about a story, kind of this is the story or this is the picture or visual imagery of some kind that one is attempting to create in the mind of the customer. And stories and metaphors, one might claim, are patterns. And if Mr. V.S. Ramachandran is to be believed, our brain is wired to kind of look for patterns. It wants to see patterns. Even if there isn't a pattern, it will create a pattern because that apparently reduces energy consumption in the brain. Once I have seen something that looks like a pattern to me, I do not have to invest, my brain does not have to invest the time and energy to do all that evaluation. A brain is an energy conserver in a sense. And so therefore, the metaphor, in a sense, then becomes the pattern that the brain latches onto. And if it's an incomplete metaphor, the brain is able to complete the metaphor through curiosity, and that allows it to go more quickly into the non-declarative side. I'm kind of extrapolating a little bit from what you said, Vinod. Would you say that's a reasonable approximation, extrapolation, Vinod? First yourself, and then I will go to Harish.
Yeah, I think the story idea is important here, right? Like, I mean, you're right. We always look for patterns. We want completeness in our understanding of how things work. Now, the first part is to engage you. So you want to even get involved in trying to complete the story or make a story out of it. If it's not interesting and you don't even get to that phase, then you're not going to get anywhere with that. And that's why an interesting metaphor is important, because if it piques your interest and then it makes you spend that extra minute to create a story out of it, then it's definitely going to be much better in terms of being remembered at a subsequent point of time, in terms of capturing your attention for subsequent exposures to things coming from the same brand, and as a result in leading you or accelerating you towards moving to the other side, where it becomes a brand that's embedded, that the interference is not going to wash it out that easily anymore. It's now stored in memory, and you're going to remember it much better regardless of what else is happening.
Harish?
So I do agree with you that our brain has certain, archetypes stored within it. And the more you appeal to those archetypes which lie within our brain, the more successful the brand becomes at metaphors or at storytelling. So if you look at storytelling in advertising itself, or the way brands express themselves, there are some metaphors which work very well with the Indian consumer. And I'm not so sure about consumers outside India because I've primarily worked in the country. So there is, of course, the story of the brand being the hero, which defeats a villain, and you see those kind of stories very well. Building metaphors of a brand having a certain function, but it's demonstrated as a hero which beats back some villain and wins for the consumer. You have the story of the eternal quest, where you're looking to find a fortune, you go and find it, and many brands have actually used that story as well. But then you have a story of a voyager going out on a voyage and returning with the treasure. That story once again is used by many brands. There is the archetypical story of falling in love, and that is used by many brands as well to conjure up a lot of emotion. So you're right. I think there are strong archetypes sitting in our mind, and I think there are these 10 or 12 archetypes which brands use, which sit very well with Indian consumers. But having said that, the other thing that I notice in India, Arvind, is the use of archetypes and metaphors which are derived from Indian epics and Indian history. Very, very popular with the way brands advertise in the country, because virtually everyone here knows the story of Ramayana and Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita and so forth, and some of those metaphors sit within our minds. Similarly, metaphors relating to animals sit very well within our minds. I have noticed brands, take for instance a brand like Jaguar. Just by saying Jaguar, there's a metaphor of a certain purring of the big cat, the power and the energy and the movement forward which sits in your mind. So the ability of a brand to get to a metaphor which is already deeply embedded in your mind and then pull it out by talking about it can I think work very well for brands. But I do agree with Vinod that the use of metaphors does work in embedding a brand very strongly, and typically does it perhaps better than emotion, because like he says, sometimes emotion overpowers the true story of the brand. You remember the emotion, but you don't remember the core of the brand, whereas the metaphor can actually do both.
So then, if that is the case, would it be correct to say that if I want to get into the non-declarative memory and I have to make a choice between metaphor and emotion, I mean, that's probably a false choice, but nevertheless, let me make that point. If I have to make a choice between a metaphor and emotion, I should go with metaphor. Ideally, I should have metaphor with emotion to get that engagement, to accelerate the movement into the non-declarative side.
Yeah, I think for creative people and people that are designing ads and stuff like that, it's always important to remember what the bottom line is, and the bottom line is to promote the product and the brand. So that's you always want to make sure that the storyline is building towards it, and that link is made very clearly. Like people somehow associate whatever you're using to draw the emotions or people's attention eventually completes the narrative in terms of tying it back to what the product is or what the story is. And as long as people can do that effectively, that's what would make an effective creative or an effective advertisement, and transition that to memory subsequently too.
Okay. Yes, Harish.
I would also agree with that, Arvind. I think by its very nature, emotions linked to a brand may vary over time, and you may over a 20, 30, 40-year span, brands may actually traverse 2 or 3 emotions in related spaces. But a metaphor, I think, is more long term, remains in your memory for much longer. And whether the metaphor is expressed through symbolism, whether it's expressed through storytelling, whether it's expressed through sometimes through even the mascot of a brand, I think it remains very, very strongly in your memory.
So thank you. I think that was a very, very interesting part of our conversation. Let me now turn the conversation a little bit, again, still building on what we have discussed so far. So we talked about memory and declarative and non-declarative memory, and getting into the non-declarative part through various ways. Ultimately, as researchers and practitioners, the other side of the equation is that, yes, once something is embedded in the mind of the customer is going to make a decision. Now, that decision, if I'm a practicing marketer, I would hope goes in my favor. And my competitor, of course, would hope that it goes in their favor. Now, when the customer is therefore making a decision, the question that I have for both of you is, what will be the driver of this decision? If one is saying that some part of the memory are in the declarative part, some are in the non-declarative part. So if I can use the words conscious and unconscious, and we have also put emotion in the equation. There is cognition as well. Uh, how do I know for a particular situation what is the driver of the decision at a given point in time? Why would someone buy a Bajaj Pulsar versus a TVS Apache? Uh, these are, by the way, two bikes in the slightly non-entry, not the higher end and not at the entry level, but between around 1.3 lakhs to around 2.5 lakhs as a price range, 150cc to 220cc bike. So why? What is the driver? What combination drives it? How does one access it? Is there some research that points us in that direction? Are there some extra examples from your experience, Harish, that you would want to share with us and the audience? So I'll go with Vinod first, and then Harish.
What you asked is actually an entire research question. I there are so many factors again, right? Like context plays such an important role. There is the whole idea of individual differences again. There are constraints with respect to things like price and other features that are available. So the decision process is extremely complex. But I think the most important one related to your question is obviously all of these things play an important role. So one of the things that matters when you're making the decision is the current context, like where you are, how you're purchasing this, and how you're going about that is of course important. Are you doing this online? Are you doing it in a store? If you're doing it in a store, is it individually arranged by brand, or is everything available at a single store that you can pick? You can do the comparisons live and so on. So that's one. But then memory becomes an important factor here. So when you are at the point of decision, what comes to mind first? Like, what do you remember? Do you remember the ads, and do you remember your friends that have driven either of those bikes that you were talking about, and what was their experiences, and how do you feel about that? Have you seen them do that, and what have they shared with you when they're doing about this? So that's one way in which memory comes into play. And then of course there is the emotions basically, which is again like when you think about these instances, like what kind of emotions does that induce, and does that make you feel good about the whole process, or does it make you think about like, oh, what like some kind of experience regret, like what if this happens, but what if I missed out on an opportunity to do this, and so on, right? So there are so many factors, and the most important thing is the weight or the way people integrate these factors is definitely going to differ across people. Not everybody is going to give 50% weight to what the friend says and 30% weight to what they saw in an ad or whatever. Those numbers are not going to be the same. Those numbers are going to depend on a variety of different factors. And so the best thing that you can do is you can keep working on this. You can make sure that the top of the mind that comes to bike when people are thinking about purchasing bikes is the brand that you're trying to push. But you can't reach out to every single person and make sure that everybody who is currently purchasing a bike only buys the bike that you're interested in. There are going to be other factors that dictate it, but as long as you do everything that you can do to get into the consideration set and make sure people understand what the values are in purchasing your particular brand, I think that's the part where the advertising links to the decision. After that, there are things that you can do in terms of choice architecture, in terms of nudging people, in terms of making something the default option or what is shown first. All those things all become important from a purchasing perspective. But again, it's a whole different research question that we are talking about in that scenario.
Completely agree. I think you know what triggered the question as well, Vinod. We were talking about it yesterday. Harish, go on.
So my thought first and foremost, Vinod and Arvind, I believe that consumers develop a consideration set for a category that they're interested in. If you're interested in a category, then you have a consideration of set of brands. And typically, from my experience, I've seen consumers have at best about 3 brands in their consideration set in a category. So firstly, if you don't fall into that consideration set, then the consumer is not going to consider you whatever said and done. My belief is that once a brand falls into that consideration set, a number of things then impinge on your memory. The recommendation of your friends and the recommendation of people whom you trust, reviewers whom you trust, plays a critical role. If you have used that brand in your past, your own usage experience plays a critical role in your memory before you decide to repeat purchase. The advertising that you have seen, the chord that advertising is struck with you, the resonance that we talked about, that plays a clear role in your decision-making process. Of course, functional aspects like the price, functional aspects like the horsepower or whatever, the functional aspects of that particular bike, or in some categories, the functional aspects are clearer than in others. In a bike or a car, they're much clearer than when you buy a bottle of perfume, for instance. So the functional aspects play a key role. In a country like India, my belief is when you're buying a durable like a bike or a car, I think the service networks plays a clear role. What kind of service network does that brand have in the future? But all these put together, I think Arvind will elevate one of those brands in the consideration set to being number one. And like Vinod has said, how do you actually weight these variables? I think the weighting can be very different for different people. It really depends on, some consumers are more risk averse than others. They will tend to weight it in favor of the functional attributes. Some consumers are by nature more emotive than the others, and they will go with a brand which shares their sense of purpose or resonance. So it would be a good research exercise, Arvind, to actually see how these weights differ from one person to the other. And these are all categories which are, I think, considered purchases. As far as impulse purchases are concerned, I think there it's primarily driven by emotion and driven. You want to buy a chocolate off the road when you walk into the Kirana store. It's driven primarily by the context at that point in time, and some recall of the brand, some positive recall of the brand. I would say a combination of those two.
So Harish, just to pick up on one point that you made a little while earlier, where you said that some consumers might be risk averse and they will look at it much more from a functional perspective. Some consumers might look at it from a different perspective. So you will recall that project that we had done with your group was in exactly along those lines on dual brand personalities and how one can help fixed mindset and growth mindset people,
Right.
and how one can construct a message on both those sides. But as both those kind of personalities are making those decisions, as a brand that is trying to sell, as a brand that is trying to advertise and get into the long-term memory and embed myself in the unconscious memory, I will still need to have a sense of what is the decision-making process going to be like, especially from the perspective of what's happening inside the head. Is the risk-averse person going to be more driven by an unconscious, non-declarative processing perspective, or is the less risk-averse person going to be driven more by the conscious declarative side, and so on? I'm thinking aloud over here. And therefore, the question to me, part of the question that has been on my mind along with an ex-doctoral student, and this is something that I was also discussing with Vinod yesterday. What is that decision-making process going to be like? How does it work? Under what circumstances? And as Vinod rightly pointed out, there will be a lot of contextual elements. There might be some recency effects, but the underlying mechanism that drives that decision making is what I guess I'm a little fascinated by. I don't know, Vinod, whether you wanted to add to that.
So Arvind, you gave me an opening, so I'm going to shift and share a different slide. Let me see if this works. Share. This is the one. Can you see my screen? I mean, it's blank. It just says a decision-making framework. Is it good?
Yeah, we can see it. Harish, it's visible to you?
Yeah, so this is something that I have been, I've spent, actually, as a little bit of a background, last year I was on sabbatical and I spent it at Ipsos. I don't know if you have heard about Ipsos, but Ipsos is a leading market research company. It's a global company. And I've been working with their science organization, essentially trying to find a bridge between academia and industry and trying to see how I can tailor some of my own work into more relevant things from an industry perspective. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time on was working through this decision-making framework. As many of you know, the most popular way of thinking about a lot of this thing, and you can see that in a lot of the discussions that we had, is this idea between conscious and unconscious. Like we always want to dichotomize this and we want to say, either it is declarative or non-declarative, either it's conscious or unconscious, or either it is automatic or deliberative. But one of the things that's fascinating is it really a dichotomy? When does it switch? Like, is it really, like when can you strongly say that it's no longer declarative, it's only non-declarative? It's not easy thing to do. Like, there are things that are clearly at the extremes where you know that it's completely embedded in your unconscious at this point. You don't need to actively think about it. That's the first brand that comes out of comes to your mind when you think about it. But that transition, when that happens from you have to think about it consciously versus it's now embedded, is not a very clear transition point. And that's the challenge in thinking about things in this perspective. And the same holds true for conscious and conscious too. Like, yes, we have some idea that I'm not spending as much time and effort in doing this, but is that zero? Is that just a tiny fraction? What's the amount where I can say at this point, I would say it's more deliberative conscious processing versus unconscious processing, right? So that's what drove us to think about it. Like, so this thing here on the right, this thing is what we call the processing effort or the processing framework. Some things are clearly on one end, they're more automatic, maybe even unconscious. Some things are clearly at the other end where you're spending more effort, they're more deliberative. But there is this gray area where it's not clear whether it is one or the other. When does this transition happen? Is this transition same for everybody? Or somebody has a very small red area and a larger blue area and vice versa. They don't do much automatically. They deliberate in most cases and so on, right? So that's one way that prompted us to think about this. So there are sometimes stimuli. So in this case, like we talked about purchasing a motorbike, you may just say, like, I know exactly what I want. This is something that I have always dreamed about, or I know all my friends have this. This is the currently most popular model. I don't need to spend any time looking at competitors, looking at alternatives, whatever it is. I'm just going to make the decision, right? So it's an automatic decision. You're ready to buy. You know this is the bike you want to buy. You buy it. You're done, right? Now that could be driven by emotion. That could be driven by some other factors too. It doesn't always have to be just emotion. It may be that that's your goal, that's your dream, whatever. Like you may have been thinking about buying this bike for a long time, and so you have the first opportunity, you buy the bike. You don't even look at what else is out in the market and so on, right? So that's the mapping between stimulus and the thing. But the challenge is not always, like I said, is this dichotomy. So way we think about this in this proposed framework is that this is more of a continuum. So at some point, it transitions from the blue to the red or the red to the blue, but it's not just two things. It's not like A versus B. It's not like in Kahneman's term or in the terms that people use, system one versus system two, but it's not like that. There is true, but there is also things in between, and it's never been clear when do you transition from system one to system two? When do you transition from unconscious to conscious? And we argue that it's not important. It's important to think about it as the degree of effort that's going in, and that degree at the extremes may be completely conscious or completely unconscious, but it could also vary in the middle, and that variability is useful, and it actually provides us a lot of insights into how people are doing this, right? And that variability is what we call some kind of adaptive processing. So this is basically the way to think about it is I decide based on the current context, how important is it? How much effort should I put into it? Should I think about this deeply? Should I consider more options? Should I spend a lot more time on it? Or am I happy just doing it fast because I know it's worked well in the past and I'm just going to go ahead with it, right? And this factor here is also influenced by other things. So things like goals and motivations. So is your goal to get the best bike out there, or is the goal to spend as little money as possible? Is the goal to focus on safety and find like which bike gives you the highest safety rating and so on. So those are all what I call goals and motivations. And then there is the knowledge self. So this is the memory part, basically. Again, is it a brand that you have purchased in the past? What are your memories about that brand? Have you been happy? Are you more likely to go back and repurchase that brand? And maybe that's all that matters. Like if it's a brand that you're extremely happy with, then all that matters is this knowledge base and nothing else matters. You just see a stimulus, or you're in a context where you have to buy something. You just say, I'm just going to buy that Tata Salt because that's what I do. I don't even have to think about what other competitors are out there in the market. And of course, the other important factor is emotions. Like when you think, and these all, if you notice that the arrows are drawn in such a way that they meet in the middle, because these can influence each other. When you think about your past experience, that might induce some kind of emotions, either positive or negative, right? So these two can influence. If you have a positive memory, then you're more likely then, as an interaction of that memory and the emotions, to buy that product again. If you had a negative experience with that brand before, then that's likely to drive you away from purchasing that brand again. And so these things all can interact with each other, and they dictate the amount of effort that you put into it based on how important this context is and how important it is to get it accurate, and so on. And then that eventually leads to action or behavior. And lastly, of course, all these feedback too. So the behavior then updates your memory. The behavior then updates your emotions, such that subsequently, when you come back to make this purchase in the future, or you encounter similar event in the future, you are influenced by what happened in the past purchase. So from that point of view, each of this is a loop, right? So this is the way we think about decision making right now. Like there are things that can fit the chocolate in the store example that Harish was talking about. That still works very well. You see a stimulus as you're waiting to check out, where basically there is this Kit Kat or candy bar over there. You just grab it impulsively. You don't think about it. You don't think about calories. You don't spend any effort into doing that. And that leads to the behavior. And that still can be explained by this model. But what this model says, though, is that everybody who picks that candy from the store does not have to be doing it impulsively. There could also be people that have planned to buy that candy. Maybe it's a kid who is going to the store who's negotiated with the mom to say, like, if I buy you these items today, I will get a candy. In that case, it's not an impulsive purchase. It is a planned, deliberative purchase, but it still happens fast. That kid is still grabbing it quickly from the shelf at the supermarket, but the mechanism is very different. And that becomes important subsequently in terms of coming up with behavioral interventions, nudges, and so on. It's important to understand what's driving the behavior. Is it purely impulsive, or is it basically something that's coming from pre-thought goals and motivations or past experiences and so on? And the last part of this, of course, is bringing in the methodologies to it. We have the tools now that we can use different methods at each of these phases to try and understand better what the process is, or what is it that's driving some of these effects. So I've done a brief mapping of some of the tools that can be used with each of these different phases that we are talking about.
Thanks, Vinod. That was really informative. Maps with some of the stuff that we are doing. Yeah, I just want to say that the only thing that I would say is differently is, which you've actually alluded to, but it's not there explicitly over here, is the balance between reason and emotion, deliberation and non-deliberation, if you will. Of course, one can argue as to what exactly is reason and what is emotion from a neurophysiological standpoint. So I don't know what your reactions are, Harish, to this.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting model. As Vinod has been talking about this model, I've been thinking about my own experiences. And let's for a moment, Arvind, think about a category that I've been associated with for a long time, FMCG and tea, for instance. You're in the market now and you're looking at different brands of tea. Maybe you're looking at Tata Tea, Red Label, Wagh Bakri, and so forth on the shelf. Now, the simple thought that comes to me is, the memory, the emotions, your current context, the stimulus the brand is putting in front of you, and the goals, and you're in front of that counter now wanting to make your selection. If a brand, if one of those three brands, either a Tata Tea or a Red Label or a Wagh Bakri, is going to tick off, or some of these boxes would be a positive, some of them would be a scratch, some of them would be a negative. I think the deliberative processing comes in place when two or three brands between these boxes are kind of poised in some kind of equal measure. One particular brand may be high on long-term memory. I've used it in the past and it's been really good to me, so I like it. Whereas another brand, the stimulus may be very strong. Here's a brand which is offering you 50% off on the shelf, or a brand which has just launched a new pack which looks so glamorous that you feel like picking it up. But a third, maybe your own current emotions and body sensations, your own emotions, your recall of the advertising that all these three brands have done, and one of which has struck resonance with you. So the issue really is, I think, different brands would play to different parts of this, and if one brand wins completely on all these factors, I guess it would then be processed very automatically. You will not even think about it or deliberate about it. But if a couple of brands start winning on one or the other, one wins on past experience, the other wins on stimulus, then there is going to be a deliberation in the consumer's mind before they pick it up. So that's what comes to my mind, Arvind. Because if you look at FMCG brands like tea, for instance, a lot of decision making happens at the shelf. Some part of the some proportion of consumers are very, very loyal. They know which brand to buy and they come to the shelf with that choice already made. But many other customers make up their minds on the spot. And in a very short period of time, they have to adaptively process these, I guess, and come to a conclusion.
Yep.
So if I may add, actually, like one of the empirical studies that we are doing with this right now is exactly along those lines. So think of a scenario where you ask people to choose between two products, right? Now, even within the people that choose a particular brand, what is important is how long they are taking to choose that brand, or how confident they are in their choice, right? So if I just take hypothetical brand A and B, if majority of people choose brand A, but some of them do it like quickly and some of them take longer, what is interesting is then if you show an ad for competitor brand B and you ask the same question again, you can predict the people that are likely to switch just by looking at how long they are taking to make the choice in the first place. And so the idea there is that if it's embedded and it's automatic, that you know that this is what you want and you can do it quickly, you're more likely to continue to do that in the future, regardless of what you see about brand B. But those people that are on the fence, that are having to deliberate more to decide in this case which one they want to do, they can be more easily swayed by showing an appropriate brand or doing a price cut or running a promotion on the competitor brand and so on. And so the point here is that it's just not enough to know what people make. If you see like, oh, I have 80% market share today, and so I'm going to be fine. But if out of that, 50% of them are somewhat on the fence and only 30% of them are very strong people with the brand, then that 50% can easily be swayed by other kinds of promotional practices, either advertising or promotions and so on. So that's the kind of stuff that we are trying to do.
We're kind of running into a time barrier. It's 8:30 in the evening over here, but I just want to make one small point before we push to a conclusion. I kind of noticed, Harish, that you mentioned a certain brand in the context of tea apart from a Tata brand, and which was Wagh Bakri. And it's very interesting that when we compare tea brands, the relative situation of different tea brands in India, including Wagh Bakri, at least in this part of the country. So, gentlemen, I just want to say a very, very big thank you to both of you for sharing with your time with us, and what has surely been an absolutely delightful and intellectually invigorating conversation for me, definitely, and I hope it was as much for both of you. And I will look forward to connecting again to both of you very soon in different contexts. And to the audience, thank you very much for staying with us till late this evening. And we'll look forward to seeing you back tomorrow again for the remaining sessions. of this conference. Thank you, Harish. Thank you, Vinod, very much indeed.
Thank you,
so
Vinod.
much.
Thank you, Vinod. Pleasure meeting you. And thank you, Arvind. Thank you for inviting me to the panel.
Same here, Harish. I hope we can be in touch. And thank you, Arvind, again.
I look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
This session will be chaired by Professor Sahay. We have two papers in this session. The first paper is by Ms. Anuja Sathe and Ms. Apurva Gannu from the SNDT University. We welcome you here. Their paper is titled Cognitive Flexibility Strategies, Enhance Work and Engagement, and Individual Innovativeness, an Intervention Study. We request you to start your presentations. Thank you.
Sure. A very good morning to the respected panelists, guests of honor, speakers, session chairpersons, as well as our audience. We are honored to present our research here today titled Cognitive Flexibility Strategies Enhance Work Engagement and Individual Innovativeness Among Corporate Employees. I am Apurva Gannu and I'm here with my co-author Anuja Sathe. We present the outline of the presentation, starting with the introduction of the variables, including their industrial significance, followed by the method of research, the intervention plan, then the results and discussion, wherein it comprises of the quantitative and the qualitative analysis, and lastly, we come to the conclusions, limitations, and directions for future research. Introduction to the variables. Our first variable is cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is an important part of behavioral sciences. Cognitive flexibility can be understood as the person's ability to change their perspective and approach in order to adapt or adjust to the changes in the environment. To be cognitively flexible, a person needs to be aware, willing, and confident about their capacity to be flexible. Cognitive flexibility is based on two main principles, that is attentional processes and representation of knowledge. Attentional process. So the person needs high attention to understand the situation that it has undergone a shift and now requires a different response. It requires a person to assess the situation and plan the action accordingly, keeping in mind the environmental factors to avoid the formation of a set response pattern. Secondly, we come to knowledge representation. It is associated with the ways in which the knowledge is stored and the way in which this stored knowledge is used to complete a particular task.
Oh, why don't you guys also get some?
It is concerned with the ways in which different ideas are connected to deal with the situation. It also includes an important part of shifting between perspectives, which is looking at the same situation from different point of views. Our next variable is work engagement, which is the capacity of an employee to use their complete potential at work. So when engaged in work, employees get an opportunity to express themselves physically, emotionally, and cognitively. An important element of work engagement is absorption, which is being completely immersed in the work that the person is doing. Our third variable is individual innovativeness, which is a form of creativity which helps to solve complex problems as well as everyday problems while allowing the person to be flexible in nature. We then move on to the industrial significance of our variables. So industrial significance of cognitive flexibility in the corporate world. Cognitive flexibility as a concept has got great significance in the industrial and the corporate setup, especially if we take into consideration the COVID-19 scenario. India as a country was not used to the culture of working from home. The workspace offers quick problem resolution, essential amenities, proximities to different departments, and enables quick decision making also. There is a fixed way in which the company in each sector and also its departments function. With the COVID-19 scenario and the change in the work setting, there is also a requirement of a shift of attention that was initially discussed. Shift of attention would be implemented not only by focusing on the problem at hand, but also ignoring the irrelevant information that may be a part of the house setup that the person now works in. Knowledge representation will not only be in terms of using the information to solve the task at hand, but also to use that knowledge to work well in a remote manner. talking of the industrial significance of work engagement in the corporate world. So work engagement is related to work satisfaction. So a highly engaged employee is an asset to the industry, and therefore the person will also have a higher level of work satisfaction and also will be more absorbed in their work. Talking of individual innovation. Innovation is necessary in any organization and in every department. Innovative ideas help to keep an organization functioning and in top order. It also helps the organization to sustain within the market. We move on to the method of research that was implemented in our study. And before starting our intervention plan, I would like to explain you the phases in which the research took place. Talking of the phases, the experimental design was a pre-test, post-test design, which consists of 3 phases. That is the pre-test, the intervention phase, and the post-test. In the pre-test phase, we administered 3 tests. That is the cognitive flexibility inventory to measure cognitive flexibility, the Earth-Check work engagement scale to measure work engagement, and the individual innovation scale to measure individual innovativeness. In the intervention phase, 3 tasks were implemented to see whether there is an increase in the cognitive flexibility and in turn in work engagement as well as individual innovativeness. In post-test, we administered the same 3 tests as mentioned above. This enabled us to understand whether there was any difference in the response between the pre-test and the post-test phase. That is, whether our activities actually led to any difference. Moving on to the hypothesis of the research. So it was hypothesized that there is a significant difference in the level of work engagement in the pre-test intervention phase and the post-test intervention phase. And it was also hypothesized that there is a significant difference in the level of individual innovativeness in the pre-test intervention phase and the post-test intervention phase. The sampling method used here was a purposive sampling method, which essentially means that only those individuals who fit our criteria were selected for the study. The criteria involved that our corporate individuals required a minimum 2 years of work experience. They were between the age of 26 to 60 years. The data was collected from across the metro cities and across various sectors such as pharmaceuticals, IT companies, startups, banks, as well as from various departments such as HR, software development, marketing, and quality system analysis, which also comprises our population. Our research design was a mixed design comprising of a quantitative and a qualitative analysis. For the quantitative analysis, we made the use of a paired sample t-test. So a t-test is a statistical tool that we used to understand the difference between the pre-test and the post-test scores. For the qualitative analysis, essentially, the common themes and ideas that were derived from the interventions were used. Over to you, Anuja.
Thank you. Intervention plan, which I would be continuing with. I will begin from the extreme right-hand side first. There are 3 tasks or activities that were given, and the first is concept application. We asked the participants to apply the concept of reward from multiple perspectives. The next activity was 9-dot problem. It had 3 levels, which started from least to highest level of difficulty in the respective order: 5 lines, 4 lines, and 3 lines. Next slide, please. The first image is the problem which the participants were shown and they had to solve it. After showing these 9 dots, we asked them what did they perceive it as. Then we gave them the instructions to solve the task, that is using 5 straight lines, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, or a combination of all. They have to connect all the 9 dots. The instructions were same for 4 as well as 3 lines. Before beginning, we asked them about their thoughts and feelings about the task. We also noted their thinking approaches during the task solving phase. After they could or could not solve it, we again asked them about their feelings and thoughts. These questions were further used for the qualitative analysis. The second image is the solution for 5 lines. There were many possible solutions, and these 2 are the most commonly made patterns. The third image is the solution for 4 lines, and there is another distinct 4-line solution which is made in red color down, and it was only made by 1 participant. The last one is the solution for 3 lines. For the 4 and 3 lines part, the lines had to be extended out of the visual square that was formed by the 9 dots in order to solve the problem successfully. The next slide, please. The next activity was the Stroop task. It had two levels, the neutral level in which the boxes were painted in different colors and the participants had to name those colors. The second level was known as a color word condition or a worded condition, where different words related to the organization were typed in different colors. Participants had to name the color in which the word was written and not read the color and not read the word. Here we used three types of words: positively loaded words such as progress, profit, talent, reward, appraisal, engaged, etc. Neutral words like presentations, meetings, contracts, etc. And negatively loaded words like turnover, bullying, boredom, politics, etc. After the task, the participants were asked about their experience and also a memory test of the words seen in the second condition, that is the worded condition, was also conducted. Both the experience and the memory tests were further used for the qualitative analysis. Next slide, please. This slide depicts the quantitative analysis, that is the results of our mean and t-test. The first figure on the left depicts the means of work engagement in the pre-test and the post-test phase, which were 3.9 and 4.3 respectively, wherein the post-test mean was being greater than the pre-test mean. Similarly, for individual innovativeness means, pre-test mean was 69 and post-test mean was 73, wherein post-test mean was greater than the pre-test mean. T-test values for both ranged from 5.5 to 5.6 at degrees of freedom 42 and probability less than 0.05. This means that the hypothesis statistics supported our hypothesis. That is, in other words, cognitive flexibility significantly enhanced work engagement and individual innovativeness. Next slide, please. These are the results.
Can I just interrupt 1 second? I did not quite follow your manipulation of cognitive flexibility. If you can just go through that quickly again.
So do you want me to go through the intervention plan again?
Just the intervention, just the intervention.
Okay. Fine.
Between your pre and post, just the intervention.
Okay, sure, sir. Yes. So in the intervention plan, we use the following of the three activities. That is the 9-dot problem, which is depicted in the next slide in terms of images. We had
so essentially, your claim over here is that people who were able to do the task, this 9-dot problem, in 3 lines or 4 lines and 5 lines, the person who has been able to do it in 3 lines is the most cognitively flexible. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
So can we come up to the qualitative analysis?
And then for the Stroop test, the person who is able to distinguish between the word and the color of the word better, that person is more cognitively flexible. Is that what you're saying?
Right, sir. When they could name the colors faster with lesser number of errors, we could say that their cognitive flexibility levels were higher.
Okay. And then once these people have done the tasks, you are again measuring their your individual innovation, the scale that you have.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Carry on, please. You can go back to where you were.
Okay. Sir. Sure.
Thank you. Qualitative analysis first slide. Yeah, thank you. These are the results depicting qualitative analysis to understand how cognitive flexibility strategies enhanced work engagement. That is our first pair of variables. First, we come to how 9-dot problem helped us do it. We relate it to the concept of flow or absorption that Apurva explained in the introduction phase. This concept of flow or absorption or work engagement, on the other hand, consists of 3 types. First is anxiety, second is flow or absorption, and the third one is boredom. I request everyone to refer to the graph that is being attached on the left-hand side. Levels of work engagement are least to none in the anxiety and boredom spectrum, whereas maximum in the flow channel or the absorption spectrum. In this concept, the level of challenge or work difficulty and the levels of the skills to carry out these tasks are of utmost importance. X-axis denotes the skill level, whereas Y-axis denotes the difficulty or the challenge level of the task. When skill level is lower than the level of the challenge, we experience anxiety. Whereas when skills are better as compared to the task difficulty or challenge, we experience boredom. But when the skill levels match the task difficulty level, we are totally engaged or absorbed in the work and gain satisfaction out of working. Therefore, stating that staying in the flow channel gives us good level of work engagement. I request to refer to the table in blue to understand how our questions helped us make this qualitative analysis when we asked the questions before, during, and after the 9-dot task for all the 3 levels. Those participants who thought that the task was difficult before starting it were anxious while doing the task, and the success rates were lower, which relates to the anxiety spectrum of the flow model. And they were less satisfied after the task, that is, their levels of work engagement as far as the 9-dot is concerned were lower. But those who thought that the task was interesting, were excited, thought creatively, success rates were higher for these groups. To relate, they were more absorbed in the task, or they were in the flow channel. They were also satisfied at the end, showing increased levels of work engagement. They also felt rewarded and motivated for the further levels and the tasks, as they could complete the previous task successfully and happily. Therefore, we come to the second point, that reward and motivation are two of the most important factors that contribute to work engagement. Application part is constantly working on the skill set as well as the level of challenge as perceived before starting the particular project, wherein the skills level are equal to the level of challenges, and working on the internal and external reward patterns of the individual employee. Next is we understand how Stroop tasks help us increase cognitive flexibility and in turn work engagement. Stroop task is a task of focus, attention, and concentration. Attentional processes is the process which enable us to focus on the relevant parts of the information in order to tackle a particular task, while sidetracking the irrelevant information. Focusing on the relevant information keeps us engaged in the task. We also took a memory test after the Stroop task, that is the color word condition, in order to understand which words were remembered better, and we understood that participants who remembered the positive words experienced greater work engagement as in the individual data, as compared to those who memorized the negative words. Memory is a most important trigger for the emotional engagement. In the long run, we do not necessarily remember the details of the work or the project, but we remember the outcome and the rewards associated with it, which makes us feel more or less engaged in our application. Reward should be a lifetime positive experience. Clear instructions from the authorities and leaders help us focus on the relevant parts of the work rather than the irrelevant one, and giving frequent breaks help us keep more engaged. Next slide, please. The next slide depicts a qualitative analysis for the pair cognitive flexibility and individual innovation. Now we asked how the 9 dots were perceived in order to understand whether the mental set is formed. That mental set in simple words is an obstruction in innovative thinking. Those who told that it is a 9-dot or a square had a mental set that was formed, which was stronger, and the success rates for these groups were lower as compared to the second group, who said that they could form any images or any drawings or designs by using a number of lines in order to connect these dots. Mental set was also formed for this group, but however, it was less rigid and it was easy to break, leading to greater success rates for the second group. Application: observe multiple projects when on probation, or the trainee could be given an opportunity to work on multiple projects of multiple departments, just as an observer or someone as an assistant, and innovation-based activities. How Stroop tasks help us increase our innovativeness? Like we understand, there is a generic response or a natural response of reading a particular word. We are not used to naming the colors in which the words are written. Therefore, Stroop task increases innovativeness on the same principle. When we use generic ways to solve organizational problems, they may not always give us fruitful results. We need to give up on these natural or habituated ways of thinking and consciously generate a new response. In other words, create a new solution in order to tackle the situation, which is nothing but, in other words, innovativeness. Concept application. While I explain, I request you to read the blue table, which gives us multiple kinds of rewards as noted by the participants, and those highlighted in red were the rewards innovated by the participants. They might still be used by some companies or corporates, but the participants had still innovated by themselves. This was based on two concepts, that is knowledge representation, how you apply the same set of knowledge in different situations, and shifting between perspectives. Now, how is shifting between perspectives applicable in innovation? For example, HR uses reward concept by giving promotions and incentives, that is rewarding their particular employees for the performance. Whereas sales or marketing department might use it by giving offers to the customers, like a certain percent off, or say buy to get one free, in order to attract the customers. So they use the reward patterns for the customers. Both these departments use reward, but they have to shift their perspectives from the customer to the employee or vice versa in order to come up with the innovative patterns. The general observations, the participants started with common reward patterns that are usually seen and slowly innovated new reward patterns. Next slide, please. Here we come to the conclusions. Cognitive flexibility strategies are seen to enhance work engagement and individual innovativeness statistically, as well as to a great extent through the qualitative analysis. Participants noted that they could relate to the activities in their significance in the work area. Through our qualitative analysis, we might predict that individual innovativeness mediates the relationship between cognitive flexibility and work engagement. How is cognitive flexibility leads to individual innovativeness or creativity? This thought that we have created and innovated something is itself a reward, and this reward feeling, like we discussed, increases work engagement. Also, there can be gender differences in cognitive flexibility, work engagement, and individual innovativeness. However, both these points have to be further researched. Application in general is these can be applied as screening instruments during interviews, as well as to improve work engagement and individual innovativeness. Limitations, we do not consider the sectors such as education management, hospitality management, or banking sectors, etc. The gender, age, and level of experiences were not considered, which may also have an impact on the variables studied. Generic activities were used and not customized interventions in order to increase the levels of work engagement and individual innovativeness. Future directions is studying how gender, age, academic qualification, as well as the specialization, the departmental differences in which people work have an impact on the studied three variables. Developing company-specific or department-specific interventions so that they might result into better outcomes. Also, studying different sectors such as IT, banking, etc. And other variables apart from the three variables studied can also be considered. Also, the mediating, moderating factors that can have an impact on the present variables can also be studied. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
So a couple of questions, and they have to do with the methodology. You state in your paper that mood and personality can also influence the relationship between cognitive flexibility and work engagement and individual innovativeness, right?
Yes.
So did you actually control for these two in your experiment?
As of now, do you want to take that up, Anuja?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. So as of now, we did not control for it, but we just asked how the mood was before we started the intervention. Because we could not really control for the mood. So we do not have a mechanism in place right now wherein we could control for the mood.
All that is required is to have that variable in your final analysis. I mean, when I say control for it, if you measure it and then use it in your analysis, instead of just a simple t-test, if you do a slightly more advanced version, maybe, let's see, your dependent variable is, let's say, cognitive, is individual innovativeness, which you're measuring, I'm assuming, using a Likert scale, right?
Yes.
And so that can qualify as a continuous variable, and your independent variable is your level of cognitive flexibility, which you're also measuring using a Likert scale.
Yes.
And so you could run a simple regression with a moderator or a control variable that also includes mood and the kind of personality. Have you measured personality as well?
No, sir, we haven't. As of now, we haven't.
Okay. So this is a very interesting paper, actually. See a lot of potential for going forward into reasonably good journals. But one would need to think a little bit more about how you can make it somewhat more rigorous. I think it's interesting in and as it stands, but it could be a little bit more rigorous. And the findings definitely have some relevance for companies and for researchers. If we can increase, it could be also interesting to see how to increase cognitive flexibility, right? Or is that like a variable that is a given, and we cannot increase cognitive flexibility. Okay, so thank you very much, Anuja and Apurva. Let me now go to the next paper for this session. The next paper is from Bala Subramanian and Munish Thakur, and they are going to be talking about, does the grateful emotion satisfies?
Hello, Bala. Are you there?
Yeah, yes. Good morning. Thank you, sir.
So could you lower
Good
your...
morning, Dr. Bala. Dr. Thakur, please go ahead.
Yes. Hope my slide is visible.
Yes, we can see your slide.
Yeah. So gratitude is a feeling of noticing the positive things in the world. So how much I'm grateful, how much content I am. That is the feeling of gratitude. Satisfying is the tendency to select the option that is good enough. So in this study, I'm trying to find a relationship between gratitude and satisfying. Whether gratitude leads to satisfying decision. That is the focus of this study. So generally, in our day-to-day life, we have a lot of options in everything. Even choosing the restaurant, or in the restaurant also, the number of food item available. There are a lot many options available to choose. This complexity of choices or paradox of choices gives little difficulty in decision making. Some people spend more time to choose the best option, and they are called maximizers. Maximizer has the tendency to keep on generate more alternative, evaluate the alternative before arriving the decision. In opposite to the maximizing tendency is the satisfying decision, where they try to arrive a option that is good enough. They don't have the tendency to go for maximum alternative before selecting one option. Research shows that maximizers are not happy in comparison to the satisficers, because maximizers keep engaged in social comparison. They're not discontent, that's why they're going for more options. In the process of going for more options, they got fatigued and they got little annoyed also, and they are unable to arrive a good decision. Even the experimental studies also support the same. Gratitude is the tendency to notice the positive things in the life. It is the tendency to count the blessing in the life. So when you are grateful, you may not discontent. You may not go for more number of choices before selecting the option. Therefore, some of the gratitude consequences can act as anecdote to the tendency of maximizing. So the objective of the study is to find out whether the gratitude predicts the maximizing tendency. It is done through the survey method. Whether the maximizing tendency differ between high grateful group and low grateful group is the research question we have posed.
So the key question that you're trying to answer is that the higher the gratitude, the more the satisfying tendency, and the lower
Yes,
the
sir.
gratitude,
Yes, sir.
more the maximizing
Otherwise.
tendency.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
So literature says that grateful people contemplate the positive experiences or outcome. Those who are high in gratitude score, they tend to focus on their life. They count their blessing. They try to recollect the positive things in their life. So they will build a sense of satisfaction with the life. They view their life as overall more secure, safe, and fulfilling than those who have less gratitude. So the experience of gratitude may promote personal growth, a purposeful life, as well as self-acceptance. So when people have gratitude, or people with high gratitude, they invest more in the social relation, because they are recollecting the positive things in the life. They also recollect the people who helped in their life. They want to reciprocate the help, so they want to build the social relationship. So they have a communalistic value, not the materialistic value. So therefore, they are more socially integrated. They are satisfied with the life. They are less envious and depressed, less depressed than the less grateful counterpart. So people, when experiencing gratitude, or people with the high gratitude, they have less tendency for striving more. So the most significant.
Sorry to interrupt. So when you separated the groups into low gratitude and high gratitude, this is based on the scale, the gratitude adjective test list. Just
yes, sir.
So
yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll be explaining the method for
a trait variable almost, right? You're not actually priming gratitude in some way.
No, sir. Based on the trait scaling.
Okay.
The significant difference between the maximizer and satisficer is their ability to evaluate the choices, because the maximizer has the tendency to keep on evaluating more choices compared to satisficers. In some of the experimental studies conducted in the gratitude literature, it was found that in the game of a resource sharing game or cooperation versus non-cooperation, the participant developed a positive appraisal of the situation in grateful condition than the non-grateful condition. In the grateful condition, the participant tend to develop a positive appraisal of the situation as well as the helper. So they tend to immediately cooperate with the helper or even with the stranger in grateful condition. This shows that in given availability of choice, grateful people tend to quickly take a decision. They don't go for more alternatives because they positively appraise the helper, they bias towards the helper, and they quickly cooperate. So they are not going for more alternative, or they are not generating more alternative. So we are hypothesizing that the tendency to maximize significantly differ between high gratitude group as well as low gratitude group, and we speculate that those with high gratitude, they may not have the tendency to maximize more compared to the people with low gratitude. So we have collected a sample from 157 MBA students from a private university, both through online as well as offline mode. These are the measures we have used. Gratitude checklist, it has a 3-item scale. We have used that item to differentiate the student with the high gratitude as well as low gratitude. Maximizing tendency was measured with the SWOTS 2002 scale, which has a 10-item scale. So the responses were divided into 2 groups based on the gratitude score, high gratitude group as well as low gratitude group. Fiscal value test was done to compare the statistical difference of the tendency to maximization between the 2 samples. So we found a difference. There was a difference between high gratitude group as well as low gratitude group, but the difference was not statistically significant between the high and low gratitude group, which means that gratitude does not influence the tendency to maximize. So the reason may be that maximization tendency happens at the cognitive level, the generation of alternative or going for more alternative. So that process happens at the cognitive level. Gratitude may be too weak to influence the cognitive aspect. It may be confined to social relation and personal well-being only. Gratitude research says that gratitude significantly influences the relational well-being as well as personal well-being. So it may be limited to that aspect only. So drawing from moral affect theory of gratitude, moral affect theory says that gratitude is a moral emotion because gratitude is elicited in a response to a help rendered without a motive. So it's a moral emotion. As a moral emotion, gratitude may be associated with moral cognition only, or only those decision making that involves moral dilemma. So it may have little or no influence over the information processing or the information search, mainly if it is not related to moral issue. These are our statement, supportive statement why the hypothesis is not supported. Second, there is another important point, trait gratitude versus state gratitude. Trait gratitude is measured with a scale, established scale. It measures the people's general tendency to feel grateful. For example, now you can be asked how much grateful to the life, how much grateful to your family. That is a trait gratitude. That measures the trait gratitude. Whereas state gratitude is a momentary feeling. When you are receiving a help, at that moment, how do you feel grateful? particularly when you are receiving a help, at that time your momentary feeling of gratitude is more. Research shows that trade gratitude weakly predicts than the state gratitude. What are the consequences? So this may be another reason that we couldn't get the significant difference between the group. We have used the trade gratitude. We have not used any control treatment group. It could be another reason that why it was not supported. So to conclude, gratitude influence on decision making has been extensively studied in the context of pro-sociality risk preference, but its role on maximizing versus satisficing has not been explored, which was addressed in this study. We found no support for our hypothesis. Gratitude does not influence the maximizing tendency of the individual. The major limitation of the study is not going for experimental study. Survey method is one of the limitations of this study. Most of the studies of gratitude literature, as well as the decision-making literature, mainly they go for experimental study. They create a control group, treatment group. So not having that methodology is one of the major weakness we consider or limitation we consider. Even we are planning for a next set of experimental studies where we create a control group as well as treatment group, and the treatment group will undergo for 3 weeks training of gratitude. They'll be asked to write gratitude journal regularly, and at the end of the 3 weeks, we will be giving an activity that measure the maximizing or satisfying tendency. So maybe after that experimental studies, we can confidently conclude the role of gratitude in influence of tendency to maximize. Thank you. I'm happy to answer your question if I can.
So quick questions before I open it up to the audience also, if they want to ask questions to both the presenters. Some observations. First, I think the topic is an interesting topic, but probably needs to be explored a little bit further, just in the way that you have said. It would be nice to be able to prime gratitude, so measure it as a manipulated variable rather than just as a trait variable. And the other part is one would want to contextualize it in with particular primes which have to do with situations that are relatable in the business context, because just doing it as an abstract exercise on gratitude's impact on maximizers versus satisficers is a little less interesting than saying that in a business context, if I can prime gratitude in some way, then it leads to either maximizing behavior or satisfying behavior. Now, gratitude also has components. I am personally grateful for something. For example, if my colleague's mother suddenly has COVID in a different city, and I'm able to arrange a private bed for her when no beds are available, there is a personal gratitude on the part of my colleague towards me. And now the issue is that is a gratitude that is existing in the person because of something that I did, versus gratitude as a state of being, which is what is being measured just now. Some people are naturally more grateful, right? So somewhat different thing to talk about. And then the other part is when we are talking about satisficers versus maximizers, to me, it would be even more interesting if one were able to put some flesh around the idea of maximizers. What is it that they are maximizing? And what is it that they are satisfying? So maybe there is a task that one is asking them to do post the prime on the gratitude. There is some kind of a task that one is asking them to do, a business task. So if I set them a business task, then do I see a difference in the way that they are approaching the business task? Given that somebody has been primed with a high level of gratitude and somebody has been primed with a low level of gratitude, and given that some people may have naturally high levels of gratitude and naturally low levels of gratitude. So that would be my kind of observation on how one could take it further, because this is actually a very interesting area of research, and a lot of companies would be very interested in research that has been done robustly in looking at the results, especially from a perspective of how they can apply it in their own context. I don't know whether you heard Mr. Harish Bhat in the morning, where he said that looking after your employees actually pays back. In a sense, therefore, one of the questions that a company might well ask is, if I have grateful employees that have gratitude, do they become maximizers or satisficers? And what is the difference between these two behaviors in my employees or business performance, right? So interesting topic, and lots of potential to go further. Let me open it up to the audience if you have any questions on any of these two presentations. The first one on cognitive flexibility strategies, and on this one, does grateful emotion satisfies?
Yes, Mr. Kapil, you can ask the question.
Go ahead.
Hello, sir.
Yes,
The sample size. The sample size for the study on cognitive flexibility consisted of 42 individuals from different corporate sectors across India, comprised of different metro cities in India.
Question was asked, we couldn't hear it because she's answering a question.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So my question is not on these two presentation, but the topic that was earlier, Professor was discussing about the behavior economics. So we see a lot of trend in not just in India, in outside India as well, that people are promoting local made goods. They are very local for vocal. I see that trend happening in US as well, some of the other countries as well, but none of these countries has been able to successfully implement it. So can we relate this behavior with some sort of economic trend, or is this a complete kind of a political gimmick? And I'm just not talking about India sense, I'm talking globally. Have you done any study or any analysis on this?
Not to the best of my knowledge, but I think you're right in making the assumption that it is motivated by the events of the last 15 months or so. And it will be interesting to see how it plays out. And maybe you can pick up and do the study. And if you are willing to come up with a good proposal, please send it our way. We will have it reviewed, and if the proposal is a nice proposal, we are happy to support your research.
Sure. I'll try to do that on my end. Thank you.
So let me take this opportunity to kind of share that while this Behavioral Science and Management Center is based at IIM Ahmedabad, we are very open to researchers from other universities who would like to engage with us and do research. It is part of our remit to be able to promote research in this area of behavioral science and management. And so we are happy to receive proposals and to fund proposals.
So, sir, I am actually doing an accelerated general management program from IIM Ahmedabad only. So, I am a student of batch 2021 and 2022. So, but yeah, definitely, if I get some material, we'll definitely would like to share it with you and maybe partner in the analysis.
Are there any more questions? You could raise your hands if you wish to ask.
Yes, I have a question if I...
Go ahead, Govind Verma.
Yeah, so my question is to Bala Subramaniam sir. And he has pointed out, there are limitations of survey method. I would like to understand maybe from him uh, when he is talking about gratitude. How do we basically distinguish our respondent who has maybe with their good in expressing their gratitude versus they are feeling but not able to express that way. And again, among the expressed gratitude, people falsely the false gratitude versus real gratitude. So how maybe whether he has accommodated this kind of consideration in his research, or if not, if what is his thought over it?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Regarding this gratitude questionnaire, it contains three statements. Overall, I'm grateful to many things in my life. So, on looking at my life, I have a feeling that I'm grateful to a variety of things. I have a feeling of gratitude to a variety of people. This is where the gratitude questionnaire is worded. Okay. When you are strongly agreeing to the statement, it indicates that you have high gratitude. When you are disagreeing to the statement, it indicates that you have low gratitude. So this how I surveyed the gratitude of the student. Regarding fake gratitude, that is difficult to identify whether someone really uh, uh, correctly answered or they are not rightly answered. That is difficult to find out from the survey method. Rather, it is one of the limitation of the survey method. So traditionally, we are going for experimental method.
So Govind Verma and to Dr. Bala, just to kind of build on what was just said. So gratitude is an emotion that can probably also be measured using some instruments like EEG or fMRI. If you have a feeling of gratitude, you may lie about it in a self-report questionnaire. But what is happening inside your head, the brain waves, the blood flow, that is visible and that you cannot hide. And there are instruments now to measure those. At IIM Ahmedabad, we now do have a lab which has EEG and eye tracking and GSR equipment, and hopefully we should be able to also get an fMRI in the not too distant future. And these are instruments which are available to be able to measure emotions like gratitude directly rather than through self-reports. Since we are almost at 12:20 and we are due for our next session, let me close this session with a huge thank you to the presenters, Anuja Sathe and Apurva Ganu and Bala Subramanian and Munish Thakur. Thank you very much for your presentations. And I would encourage you to build on the research that you have done, both very interesting pieces of research with a lot of potential. And if we at the NSE Center for Behavioral Science can help you in any way to make your papers, your research more robust and publishable in higher order journals, we would be delighted to be a part of that journey.